The alarms on my ship went off before I even saw the border. Red light filled the narrow control room. My hands froze over the controls. Every screen in front of me showed the same warning, repeated in 12 different alien languages, all saying the same thing. Turn back. Do not cross this line. I am Vantor Elish, a historian of the Galactic Union, and at that moment, floating at the edge of a place called human territory, I understood for the first time why nobody in 50,000 years had dared to cross it. My pilot, a nervous young Dravith named Osu, turned to me with wide, trembling eyes. His voice shook. Vantor, the beacons are still active. After all this time, they are still broadcasting the warning. Someone is still maintaining them. I stared at the black stretch of space ahead of us. It looked empty. No ships, no lights, no sound. Just endless dark, and somewhere far beyond it, a species that every civilization in the galaxy had agreed, without ever writing it down, to leave alone. I had heard about this place since I was a child. My teachers called it the Dead Zone. They never explained why. They simply said, "Do not go there," and moved on to the next lesson, as if the subject itself was too heavy to hold for more than a few seconds. When I asked questions, the answers were always the same. Old stories, old fears, nothing worth remembering. But I remembered anyway. Children always remember the things adults refuse to explain. Now I was an adult, sitting on the edge of that same silence, sent here by the Galactic Historical Council to finally answer the question nobody else wanted to touch. What happened to the humans? Why does an empty stretch of space still terrify every species that has ever heard its name? I opened a channel to Osu. Bring us closer, just to the beacon line. We are not crossing yet. He nodded, though his hands did not stop shaking. As we moved forward, the beacon grew larger on my screen. It was old, ancient even by our standards, built from metal that had clearly been repaired many times over thousands of years. Someone, or something, had kept it running long after most empires would have let it fall apart. The message it broadcast was simple. No threats, no demands, just 3 words, translated into every known language of the galaxy. Do not proceed. I recorded the signal, then sat back in my chair, letting the weight of it settle over me. Most warnings in the galaxy came with explanations. Territorial claims, political borders, military zones. This one had none of that. It did not say who owned this space, or why crossing it was dangerous, or what would happen if someone ignored it. It simply told you to stop, as if the reason was too obvious or too painful to write down. Osu broke the silence. My grandmother told me a story about this place. She said her grandmother told her that if you cross that line, you never come back. Not because you die, because you see something you cannot explain to anyone else. I asked him what he meant. He shook his head. I do not know. She never explained it either. Nobody explains it. That is what frightens me the most. That was the truth I kept running into, no matter which species I studied, no matter which archive I searched. Nobody explained it. Every story about humans ended the same way, with someone refusing to say more, as if the memory itself was dangerous to speak aloud. I had spent 6 years preparing for this mission. I had read every surviving record from a dozen different empires. I had studied trade maps 100,000 years old, watching as the boundaries of human territory appeared on newer and newer charts, always marked the same way, always avoided the same way. I had interviewed elders from 3 different species, and every single one of them had reacted the same way when I mentioned the word human. A pause, a change in their breathing, sometimes a physical step backward, even though I was not a threat to them. Fear like that does not come from nothing. Fear like that is built. It is taught, passed down, reinforced across generations, until it stops being a memory and becomes something closer to instinct. I wanted to know what built it. The Galactic Council had argued for months before approving my mission. Half of them believed the humans were extinct, wiped out so completely that even their homeworld had gone silent. The other half believed the opposite, that the humans were still there, waiting behind that invisible line, more dangerous now than they had ever been. Nobody could agree, because nobody had actual evidence. Only fear, passed down like an heirloom nobody wanted, but nobody could throw away either. I looked at the beacon again. It hummed quietly, sending its message out into the dark, over and over, exactly as it had for 50,000 years. Whoever built it clearly did not want to fight. If they wanted to attack anyone who crossed the line, they would not need a warning beacon at all. They would simply wait in silence and strike. That thought unsettled me more than anything else. A species capable of instilling this much fear across the galaxy, and yet choosing to warn people away instead of ambushing them, was not behaving like a monster. It was behaving like something that had learned, through painful experience, exactly what happens when frightened people stumble into a fight they do not understand. Osu's voice pulled me back. "Vantor, we are at the edge. What do you want to do?" I looked at the black space ahead of us one last time, then made my decision. "Hold position here. We are not crossing today. First, I need to understand what happened before we ever came close to this border. I need the full story, not fragments, not fear, the truth." Osu let out a breath he had clearly been holding for a while. "So we are going back?" "For now," I said, "but only to gather what we need. I intend to come back to this exact spot, and when I do, I intend to cross it." He did not argue, though I could see the relief in his shoulders as he turned the ship around. As we pulled away from the border, I kept watching the beacon on my screen until it faded into the darkness behind us, still broadcasting its warning, still waiting for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to ignore it. I did not know yet what I would find on the other side. I did not know if the stories were exaggerated, softened by fear, or if the truth was somehow worse than anything anyone had told me. But I knew one thing for certain as we turned back toward Kalik space that day. 50,000 years of silence does not happen by accident. Something happened at that border. Something big enough and terrible enough that every species who witnessed it agreed, without a single treaty or law, to never go near it again. I intended to find out exactly what that something was, no matter how deep I had to dig, or how many old, frightened voices I had to convince to speak. As our ship pulled further away, Osu glanced at me one more time. "Do you think we will find the humans still alive out there?" I did not answer right away. Instead, I thought about the beacon, still running after 50,000 years, still being maintained by someone who cared enough to keep it working. "I think," I finally said, "that whoever is out there wants to be left alone, and I think the entire galaxy has been too afraid to ask them why." The ship entered the jump corridor moments later, leaving the border, and its silence, behind us. But even as the stars stretched into streaks of light around us, I could not stop thinking about that beacon, humming quietly in the dark, waiting for someone to finally listen to what it was truly trying to say. The Kalik archive was buried 3 levels beneath the capital city, in a section reserved for records too old, too fragile, or too disturbing for public access. I had been given clearance to enter it only after the council approved my mission, and even then, the archivist who let me in looked at me like I had asked for something forbidden. "You are researching the dead zone," she said, not as a question. "I am researching humans," I corrected her. She flinched at the word, just slightly, the same way Osu had flinched when he spoke of his grandmother's warning. Most people who come down here looking for that word leave without finding much. The records are scattered. Incomplete. On purpose, I think. On purpose by who? She shrugged. Fear does strange things to how people keep records. Sometimes it is easier to write less than to write the truth. I spent the first 3 days simply sorting through fragments. Old reports from trade ships that claimed to have seen the edges of human space centuries after the war, describing lights on a distant world and then nothing else, as if the writer had been too afraid to continue. Diplomatic logs from long-extinct empires, mentioning humans only in passing, always with a tone of caution, never with details. Military assessments, written in the dry, clinical language soldiers use when they do not want to admit they are frightened, describing an enemy that adapted faster than anyone thought possible, then stopping mid-report, unfinished, as if the author had never come back to complete it. None of it painted a clear picture. All of it painted the same feeling: dread. On the fourth day, I found something different. A single entry, buried in a database of oral histories collected nearly 10,000 years ago, listed the name of a survivor. Not a survivor of a battle, a survivor of contact. Someone who had actually been present when the war with the humans took place, kept alive for reasons the record did not explain, and who had, at some point, given a short interview before disappearing from all further records. The entry gave a location: a quiet moon on the outer edge of Galactic space, home to a small, aging population of a species called the HFY, one of the oldest cultures still alive in the galaxy. If the survivors' descendants still lived there, it was worth a visit. I brought Asu with me, mostly because he refused to let me go alone, and partly because I suspected I would need someone else to keep me steady if what I found was as heavy as I feared. The moon was cold and quiet, its surface covered in pale blue grass that bent under a thin wind. The HFY who lived there were reclusive by nature, uninterested in modern technology, choosing instead to live in stone dwellings built centuries ago by their ancestors. When we arrived, an elder met us at the edge of the settlement, her eyes pale with age, her posture straight despite what must have been an extraordinarily long life, even by her species standards. "You are here about the old story," she said, before I had even introduced myself. I asked how she knew. "Because no one else comes here anymore," she said simply. "Everyone who visits this moon now is looking for the same thing." She led us into a small stone room, lit only by a single glowing crystal on the wall. She moved slowly, carefully, and when she finally sat across from us, she studied my face for a long moment before speaking again. "My name is Farrell. My great matriarch was there. She lived through it. She told the story to my mother, who told it to me, and I have told it to no one else, because every time I speak it aloud, I feel as though I am standing at the edge of that battlefield again." I asked her gently if she would be willing to share it with me. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I began to wonder if she would refuse entirely. Finally, she nodded. "I will tell you what I know, but understand, historian, that what I know is only a fraction of what happened. My great matriarch did not see everything. No one who survived saw everything. That, I think, was part of what made it so frightening. No one understood the whole picture, only pieces of it, and each piece was terrible enough on its own." She began to speak, her voice steady but distant, as if she were reciting words that had been repeated so many times they no longer felt like her own. 50,000 years ago, before the Galactic Union existed, before most of the empires you know today had even formed, there was a coalition of species who controlled most of known space. They called themselves the Old Compact. They were powerful, organized, and confident. When their scouts discovered a small, primitive world called Earth, populated by a species that had barely begun exploring its own solar system, the Compact saw an opportunity. A resource-rich world, defended by nothing more than outdated weapons and no allies in the wider galaxy. An easy conquest, they believed, a quick campaign that would expand their territory with minimal cost. She paused, her eyes drifting toward the glowing crystal on the wall, as if she were looking through it into another time. "My great matriarch was a junior officer on one of the first ships sent to secure the planet. She told my mother that the humans had almost no warning. Their world was not prepared for an invasion, and yet within the first days of contact, something strange began to happen. The humans did not panic the way the Compact expected. They did not scatter or surrender or beg for terms. Instead, they organized, quickly, efficiently, as though facing an overwhelming threat was something written deep into how they thought. "I mean," Farrell said, "that most species, when faced with an enemy far more advanced than themselves, either surrender to preserve what they can or collapse into confusion. The humans did neither. They treated the invasion as a problem to be solved, and they began solving it, piece by piece, faster than anyone in the Compact thought possible." She described, carefully and without much detail, how the early encounters unfolded. The compact's forces expected minimal resistance and instead found themselves facing tactics that shifted and adapted within days. Equipment that was primitive by galactic standards was used in ways nobody had trained against. Strategies borrowed from a long, complicated history on their own world, a history the compact had never bothered to study before arriving, because they assumed it was irrelevant to a species with no space technology. My great matriarch said the officers on her ship began to grow uneasy within the first month, Farrell continued. Not because the humans were winning outright. They were not yet, but because every time the compact adjusted its approach, the humans adjusted faster. It was as though they were learning the shape of the conflict even as it was unfolding around them, and using that knowledge instantly, without hesitation. I asked her if her great matriarch had ever described the humans themselves, what they looked like, how they behaved when encountered directly. Farrell nodded slowly. She said they looked fragile, soft skin, no natural armor, nothing that suggested they were built for confrontation. That was what made it so unsettling. Physically, they seemed like one of the most vulnerable species the compact had ever encountered, and yet everything about how they responded suggested the opposite. My great matriarch used to say that the humans did not act like a species trying to simply survive. They acted like a species that had already decided losing was not an option, and built every part of their thinking around that decision. Quote, the room grew quiet for a moment. Asu, who had said little throughout the entire visit, finally spoke. What happened next? Did the compact withdraw? Farrell shook her head. Not yet. Not for a long time. The compact was proud and powerful and unwilling to accept that a primitive world could resist them for long, so they sent more ships, more personnel, more resources. What began as a small campaign turned into a long conflict, stretching across years, then decades, then longer than anyone in the compact had ever planned for a single dispute. She looked directly at me then, her pale eyes steady despite the weight of what she was describing. My great matriarch told my mother something I have never forgotten, historian. She said the humans did not act to protect territory, or resources, or even survival alone. She said they carried themselves as though something inside them refused to accept the idea that they could lose, no matter how impossible the odds became. And the longer things continued, the more that refusal seemed to make them stronger, not weaker. I asked her the question I had been holding since I first arrived. How did it end? Farrell was silent for a long moment. When she finally answered, her voice had grown quieter, almost a whisper. That is not a story I can tell you today, historian. That story belongs to someone else, someone who was closer to the end than my great matriarch ever was. I can only tell you what I know of the beginning. For the ending, you will need to look elsewhere, if such records still exist. I pressed gently, but she would not continue. Instead, she rose slowly from her seat, signaling that our conversation had reached its limit for the day. Before we left, I asked her one final question. I asked her if she believed the humans were still out there, behind that border, after all this time. She considered the question carefully, then answered in a way that stayed with me long after we left her moon. I do not know if they are the same as they once were. 50,000 years is a long time, even for a species as determined as they were. But I know this. My great matriarch never once, in her entire life, referred to the humans as monsters. She was cautious of them, yes. Everyone who lived through that time was cautious of them, but she respected them more than she feared them. And I have always believed that the two feelings were connected, historian. Perhaps you should keep that in mind when you finally decide to cross that border yourself. As Asu and I returned to our ship that evening, the cold wind of the moon pulling at our coats, I found myself turning her words over and over in my mind. Every record I had studied painted the humans as something to be feared. But Farrell's story, passed down through generations from someone who had actually lived through those events, painted something more complicated. Not a monster, not a villain, something closer to a species that had been pushed into a corner and had responded in a way the rest of the galaxy had never expected and never fully understood. I still did not have the ending. But for the first time since beginning this mission, I felt as though I was finally getting close to the truth, one careful, trembling story at a time. 3 weeks after leaving Farrell's moon, I received a message that changed the direction of my entire investigation. A colleague at the Calyx Salvage Authority had come across something unusual while cataloging wreckage from an old derelict ship, found drifting far outside normal shipping lanes. The ship's hull markings matched no known Calyx design. When the salvage team ran the symbols through an old translation database, one word came back clearly enough to raise alarms across the entire department: compact. I traveled to the salvage station myself, unwilling to trust something this important to a report alone. The ship, when I finally saw it in person, was smaller than I expected, its hull scarred and pitted, clearly built for war rather than comfort. Most of its systems had long since failed, but its data core, remarkably, had survived, protected by shielding so thick that even after tens of thousands of years, fragments of its memory remained intact. It took my team nearly 2 months to recover and translate a usable portion of the logs. What we found was not a single record, but a series of command reports, written by an officer identified only by rank and designation, someone who had clearly held a senior position within the Compact's military structure during the earliest years of the war. I will not pretend the translation was perfect. 50,000 years of decay leaves gaps, and some sections were lost entirely. But what remained painted a picture far more detailed than anything Farrell had been able to offer, because these were not memories passed down through generations. These were reports written in real time by someone who was there. The earliest entries were confident, almost dismissive. The officer described Earth as a low-priority target, expected to fall within a matter of months. Compact forces outnumbered the human defenders by a wide margin, and initial assessments suggested human technology was centuries behind galactic standards. On paper, the conclusion seemed obvious, but the tone of the reports began to shift within the first 100 days. One entry described how a human commander, referred to repeatedly by the name Daniel Whitmore, had organized what remained of Earth's scattered defense forces into a single coordinated resistance, despite having no prior experience with the kind of warfare the Compact was bringing to his world. The officer noted, with clear unease, that Whitmore's forces did not fight the way military doctrine predicted. Instead of concentrating their defenses around obvious targets, they spread out, using terrain, weather, and even their own cities in ways that made every Compact advance costly, slow, and unpredictable. Another entry, dated several months later, described something the officer called industrial acceleration. Human factories, many of them repurposed within days of the invasion beginning, began producing weapons and equipment at a pace the Compact's own analysts considered impossible for a species with such limited resources. The officer wrote that captured human engineers, when questioned, explained their approach with unsettling simplicity. They were not trying to match Compact technology. They were trying to solve the specific problems the Compact's technology created, one battlefield failure at a time, using whatever materials were available. I remember reading that particular entry several times, trying to understand the full weight of what it meant. The Compact had brought an overwhelming military force to a world with no space technology, expecting an easy victory. Instead, they had accidentally handed an entire species a very specific, very motivating problem to solve. And humans, it seemed, were disturbingly good at solving problems when the alternative was losing everything. The reports grew longer and more detailed as the war continued. One officer described an incident in which a group of human engineers, led by a woman named Grace Ellery, modified civilian machinery to disrupt Compact communication systems during a critical offensive, buying enough time for ground forces to reposition and avoid what would have been a devastating loss. Another entry mentioned a young officer named Oliver Kane, who reportedly turned the wreckage of 3 destroyed Compact vehicles into a working defense system within a single night, using nothing but salvaged parts and improvised knowledge. What struck me most, reading these reports, was not any single act of cleverness. It was the pattern. Every failure the humans experienced seemed to become the foundation for their next advantage. Every compact strategy that worked once rarely worked twice, because by the time it was used again, the humans had already studied it, adapted to it, and prepared a response. The officer writing these reports began to express something I had not expected to find in a military document. Not fear exactly, not yet, but a growing, uneasy respect. One entry read, translated as closely as our linguists could manage, "We came here expecting to conquer a world. Instead, we are teaching an entire species how to fight a war it did not know it was capable of fighting. Every month we remain, they become more dangerous, not less. I recommend the Council reconsider our timeline for victory." I paused on that line for a long time when I first read it. A senior compact officer, writing home not to boast of an easy conquest, but to warn his own leadership that continued engagement was making the enemy stronger. That was not the language of an empire crushing a primitive world. That was the language of an empire beginning to realize it had made a serious miscalculation. The reports continued for what the timestamps suggested was nearly a decade. Human resistance did not weaken as the war dragged on. If anything, the opposite occurred. Entries described coordinated human offensives that reclaimed territory the Compact had considered secure. They described human ships, crewed by galactic standards but built at a staggering pace, beginning to challenge Compact vessels in orbit. They described a growing sense, among Compact command, that victory was no longer a question of if the humans could be defeated, but whether the cost of defeating them was worth what remained to be gained. One of the final entries in the recovered data core stood out above all the others. It was shorter than the rest, written in a tone that felt different from everything that came before it. Less formal, more personal. "I have served in 3 previous campaigns before this one," the officer wrote. "I have seen species surrender within weeks of first contact, unwilling to risk annihilation against superior technology. I have seen species fight bravely, then fall, because bravery alone was never enough to close the gap between our forces and theirs. I have never, in any of those campaigns, encountered a species that treated an impossible war as motivation rather than as a reason to surrender. The humans do not fight like people trying to survive an invasion. They fight like people who have already decided, individually and collectively, that surrender is simply not an option they are willing to consider. I do not know how this war ends, but I no longer believe it ends the way the Council originally intended." That entry was the last clear passage recovered from the data core. Whatever followed had been damaged beyond translation, lost to time, and the slow decay that even the best shielding could not fully prevent. I sat with that final entry for a long time after finishing my review, turning it over in my mind the same way I had turned over Farrell's words weeks earlier. 2 very different sources, one an alien elder recalling a story passed down through generations, the other a compact military officer writing in real time from the middle of the conflict, and both had arrived at strikingly similar conclusions. The humans had not fought like a species trying merely to endure. They had fought like a species incapable of imagining any outcome other than victory, and that mindset alone had made them far more dangerous than their technology ever suggested. I returned to the Kalic archive with copies of the translated logs, determined to find whatever remained of the war's final chapter. If the Compact's own officers had begun to doubt their ability to win, something had to have happened to end the conflict entirely. Somewhere in the old, half-forgotten records of 100 different empires, there had to be an account of how the war finally concluded, and why the ending had frightened the galaxy so deeply that the border had remained sealed for 50,000 years. I did not yet know what I would find, but after reading those reports, one thing had become unmistakably clear to me. The humans had not been a footnote in galactic history, a small, primitive species crushed under the weight of a superior empire. They had been something the Compact never expected and never fully understood until it was far too late to change course. Whatever ended that war, I suspected, would tell me more about humanity than anything I had uncovered so far. It took me nearly a year to find what I was looking for, and when I finally found it, the discovery came from a place I had least expected. A trade envoy from a distant, mostly isolated species called the Wren had, generations ago, recovered a black box from a compact command vessel found abandoned near the edge of what used to be neutral space. The Wren had no interest in the recording itself. They simply cataloged it, stored it, and forgot about it, the way many old artifacts end up buried in storage rooms nobody visits. It was only when my research request reached their archives, cross-referenced against thousands of similar entries, that a low-level clerk noticed the ship's designation matched a compact vessel listed as missing during what their internal records vaguely called the final campaign. I traveled to the Wren homeworld myself, uncertain whether the recording would offer anything useful, or whether it would simply be another fragment of static and half-finished reports, like so much of what I had already reviewed. What I found instead was the clearest, most complete account of the war's ending that existed anywhere in the galaxy, as far as I could determine. The black box contained nearly 6 hours of recovered audio and limited visual data, recorded during what the compact internally referred to as Operation Final Resolve. According to the surrounding documentation, the Compact Council, after years of mounting losses and dwindling political support at home, had authorized one last, massive offensive against Earth. Every remaining warship, every soldier who could be spared, every resource the Empire could still commit, had been gathered into a single overwhelming force, intended to end the war in a single decisive strike, regardless of cost. The recording began with the calm, procedural tone typical of military communications. Ship designations, formation orders, standard countdowns before a coordinated advance. For the first 20 minutes, nothing suggested anything unusual was about to happen. It sounded, if anything, like the beginning of a battle the Compact fully expected to win. That confidence did not last. Roughly 30 minutes into the recording, communication between compact vessels became increasingly chaotic. Officers began reporting formations breaking apart under coordinated human counterattacks that seemed to anticipate compact movements before they were even executed. One voice, identified in the records as a fleet commander, could be heard repeatedly, demanding updated positioning data, his tone shifting from irritation to something closer to disbelief as reports continued describing losses far beyond anything the Compact's own projections had allowed for. Then, roughly 2 hours into the recording, something happened that even I, after everything I had already learned, was not fully prepared for. A new voice entered the communication channel, human, calm, measured, in a way that felt almost unsettling given the scale of the battle unfolding around it. The Wren archivists had preserved a partial translation alongside the original audio, created decades earlier by a linguist who had apparently taken a personal interest in the recording. According to that translation, the voice belonged to a human officer named Edward Lang, speaking on an open channel intended to reach every remaining compact vessel still capable of receiving transmissions. I have listened to that recording more times than I can count since first hearing it. I still find it difficult to describe the effect it had on me. Lang did not threaten the retreating compact fleet. He did not demand surrender, or issue an ultimatum, or use the moment to declare victory. Instead, according to the translation, his message was simple, direct, and almost painfully calm. He told the remaining compact ships that human forces held a clear tactical advantage at that moment, sufficient to destroy the majority of the retreating fleet if they chose to press the engagement further. He stated plainly that they were choosing not to do so. He explained that human forces would allow safe passage for any ship willing to withdraw immediately, without pursuit, without further conflict, and without any additional demands beyond that single condition. He closed the message with a line the translator had marked as difficult to render precisely, but which came through, as closely as language allowed, as this: "We are not interested in destroying what remains of you. We are only interested in making certain you understand exactly what you chose to start, and exactly what we chose not to finish." The recording continued for another 2 hours, capturing the chaotic, disorganized withdrawal of what remained of the compact fleet. Ships that had entered the battle as part of an overwhelming, confident force left it in fragments, many of them damaged beyond repair, limping back toward compact space in near total silence. What struck me most, listening to that recording again and again, was not the battle itself, though the scale of it was staggering even in audio form. It was the silence that followed Lang's message. No cheering, no triumphant declarations from the human side. No further communication at all, in fact, beyond a brief confirmation that compact vessels were being allowed to withdraw unharmed. The humans, having just secured what should have been the most significant military victory of their entire existence, chose to say almost nothing about it. I began searching for any additional context that might explain what happened after that battle, and eventually found scattered references, buried across several unrelated archives, that filled in more of the picture. According to what I was able to piece together, the human forces did not pursue the war beyond that final engagement. They did not attempt to reclaim territory beyond their own solar system. They did not send envoys demanding reparations, or territory, or any of the things a victorious empire might typically pursue after successfully repelling a decades-long invasion. Instead, they simply stopped, consolidated their own defenses, and began the slow, careful work of establishing a boundary around their space, marked not by aggressive patrols or weapons platforms, but by the same kind of quiet, persistent warning beacons I had encountered at the edge of the dead zone myself. One record, an old diplomatic memo from a species that had maintained limited contact with the compact during the war's final years, offered what I believe is the closest thing to an explanation for why this restraint frightened the galaxy so deeply. The memo, written by an official who remained unnamed in the surviving copy, argued that an empire seeking conquest or revenge was, in a strange way, predictable. Its goals could be understood, negotiated with, or eventually exhausted. But a species capable of inflicting a decisive, devastating defeat on an enemy, and then choosing, deliberately and without hesitation, to walk away from every advantage that victory offered, was something far harder to categorize. It suggested a kind of discipline and a kind of confidence that did not need external validation. It suggested a species that was not interested in domination, because domination had never been the point in the first place. They had wanted only to be left alone, and once that goal was achieved, they stopped, without any further ambition on display. That, according to the memo, was what made the rest of the galaxy so uneasy. A hungry empire can be reasoned with. A satisfied one, confident enough to simply stop the moment its actual goal is achieved, cannot be reasoned with in quite the same way, because it does not want anything else. There is nothing left to offer it, and nothing left to threaten it with, because it has already demonstrated it does not need external approval to determine when enough is enough. I sat with that idea for a long time after reading it. Every fear I had encountered throughout this investigation, from Farrell's careful, trembling story, to the compact officer's uneasy respect, to the eerie stillness of Lang's final message, all seemed to circle back to that same central truth. The humans had not become the most feared species in the galaxy because they were the most destructive. They had become the most feared because at the exact moment they held the most power, they chose restraint, and nobody quite understood why. I returned to the border not long after making these discoveries, standing once again at the edge of that quiet, dark stretch of space where my ship's alarms had first gone off nearly 2 years earlier. This time, I did not feel the same fear I had felt during my first visit. What I felt instead was something closer to understanding, though understanding, I was quickly learning, was not the same thing as certainty. I still did not know what I would find if I finally crossed that line. I did not know whether the humans who built and maintained those warning beacons for 50,000 years were the same species Lang had once addressed so calmly during the final moments of that ancient war, or whether time, isolation, and the slow passage of 50,000 years had changed them into something else entirely. But I knew, standing there, that I could no longer turn back without finding out. Osu, standing beside me on the bridge once again, broke the silence quietly. "Are we finally going in?" I looked out at the darkness ahead of us, thinking of Farrell's warning, and the compact officer's uneasy final report, and Lang's calm, steady voice echoing across a battlefield that had chosen mercy over annihilation. Yes, I said. It is time we finally learned the truth for ourselves. The beacon's warning grew louder as we crossed the line, its message repeating over and over across every channel our ship could receive. Do not proceed. Asu's hands trembled over the controls, but he did not slow down. Neither did I ask him to. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. No ships appeared. No weapons locked onto our hull. No voice broke through the static to warn us a second time. There was only the same quiet darkness that had surrounded the border itself, stretching out ahead of us, as though the warning beacon had been the only thing standing guard this entire time. Then, almost without warning, a new signal appeared on my screen. Not a warning this time, a greeting. The voice that came through was calm, pleasant, and entirely unlike anything I had prepared myself to hear. Unidentified vessel, you have crossed into monitored space. Please confirm your intentions before proceeding further. We are not hostile, but we would appreciate knowing who we are speaking with. I stared at the screen for a long moment, unsure how to respond. After everything I had read, every trembling story, every uneasy military report, every warning passed down across 50,000 years, I had expected something else entirely. Silence, perhaps. Or aggression. Or the kind of cold, calculated caution that Lang's final message had suggested might still exist somewhere behind that border. I had not expected to be greeted so plainly, as though I were simply another traveler who had taken a wrong turn. I answered honestly, because I could think of no reason not to. I identified myself, explained my role as a historian from the Galactic Union, and admitted, without hiding anything, that I had spent nearly 2 years trying to understand why this border had remained closed for so long. There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I began to worry I had made a mistake. Then the voice returned, warmer than before, almost amused. A historian. Well, that is certainly not something we hear very often. You are welcome to proceed, if you are willing to be patient with us. It has been a very long time since anyone came this far. Osu looked at me, his expression somewhere between disbelief and relief, and guided the ship forward at the voice's direction. What I saw over the following hours completely reshaped everything I thought I understood about humanity. I had expected ruins or heavily fortified military outposts or the kind of grim, closed-off civilization that 50,000 years of isolation and fear might produce. Instead, as we approached the first inhabited system inside human space, I found something closer to the opposite. Bright, bustling stations orbiting worlds covered in green and blue, ships moving freely between them, some clearly built for trade, others for simple travel, none of them displaying the kind of aggressive posture I had braced myself for. Signals filled every channel, not warnings this time, but ordinary conversation, laughter, music, the mundane noise of a civilization simply going about its life. We were guided to a mid-sized station near the edge of the system, where a small welcoming party waited for us at the docking bay. I stepped off my ship expecting caution, distance, perhaps even suspicion. What I found instead was curiosity, open and unguarded, on every face that greeted us. A woman introduced herself first, extending a hand in a gesture I recognized from old historical records as a traditional human greeting. Her name was Claire Bennett, and she explained, with an easy smile, that she worked as a cultural liaison for the station, a role that mostly involved welcoming the occasional traveler who managed to find their way this far into human territory. "You are the first Galactic representative we have had in a long while," she said, studying me with open interest rather than suspicion. "Actually, if I am remembering correctly, you might be the first ever. That is quite an achievement." I asked her carefully whether she understood why so few travelers had ever attempted to come this far. She tilted her head, genuinely puzzled by the question. "Honestly, not entirely. We know there is some old history involved, something from a long time ago, before most of what you see around you existed. But it has never really come up as a pressing concern. We assumed people simply were not interested in visiting." Her answer unsettled me more than any warning beacon ever had. Here was a civilization that had, for 50,000 years, existed at the center of the galaxy's deepest, most enduring fear, and the people living inside it seemed to have no real sense that the fear even existed. Over the following days, as Bennett and several of her colleagues showed me around the station and eventually a nearby settled world, I began asking more direct questions, hoping to understand how a species capable of inspiring such lasting caution could seem so entirely unaware of the weight their own history carried across the rest of the galaxy. A man named Peter Hollis, an engineer who had grown up on one of the outer colonies, offered an answer that stayed with me long after we spoke. "We do study the old records," he explained, walking with me along a quiet, sunlit path near the settlement's central square. "Every child learns about the early years, the conflict our ancestors went through when this world was first contacted, but it is taught the way most old history is taught here, as something difficult that happened a very long time ago, not as something that defines who we are today." I asked him if that felt strange to him, given what I had learned about how the rest of the galaxy still perceived his species. He considered the question for a while before answering. "I suppose it does, now that you put it that way. We do not think of ourselves as frightening. We think of ourselves as, well, fairly ordinary, honestly. We build things. We argue about small matters. We raise children and worry about the future the way anyone else does. It never really occurred to most of us that an entire border might still exist because of something that happened so long ago." I spent nearly 2 weeks inside human territory, far longer than my original mission had planned for, because every conversation seemed to open another thread I could not bring myself to leave unexplored. I met a teacher named Laura Finch, who taught local history to young students and admitted, with some embarrassment, that the war with the Compact was covered in only a few short lessons each year, treated with roughly the same weight as any other historical conflict humanity had endured on its own world centuries earlier. I met a retired officer named George Merrick, one of the few people I encountered who seemed to carry a more serious understanding of what that period had meant, though even he spoke of it with a kind of tired resignation rather than pride. "We did what we had to do," Merrick told me, sitting across from me in a quiet garden overlooking the settlement. "Nobody I ever met who lived through the stories passed down from that time wanted a second war. When it ended, our ancestors made a choice. Protect what we had, avoid provoking anyone else, and simply let the rest of the galaxy decide for itself what to make of us. I suppose, looking at how things turned out, that decision worked better than anyone expected." I asked him if he understood why the rest of the galaxy still feared crossing this border, even now. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think," he said slowly, "that fear like that does not really belong to us anymore. It belongs to whoever is still carrying it. We built the beacons because we wanted peace, and we wanted to be left to live our own lives without interference. If people out there decided that quiet request meant something more frightening than we intended, that is not really something we can control from in here." That conversation, more than any other, helped me understand what I had been circling around since the very beginning of this investigation. The fear that had shaped 50,000 years of galactic behavior was never really about the humans as they existed today. It was about a moment, 50,000 years old, when an ordinary, struggling species had been pushed to the very edge of everything it valued and had responded in a way nobody expected, then chosen, at the height of its power, to simply stop. The rest of the galaxy had spent 500 centuries treating that single, restrained decision as though it were a permanent threat, hanging silently over the border, never fading, never explained. Meanwhile, on the other side of that same border, an entire civilization had grown, changed, and moved on, largely unaware that anyone was still afraid of them at all. Before I left, Bennett walked with me back to my ship, the same easy warmth in her expression that had greeted me on my very first day inside human space. "You seem thoughtful," she said, studying my face as we approached the docking bay. I told her, honestly, that I was still processing everything I had learned. I explained, as carefully as I could, the fear that still gripped the rest of the galaxy, the trembling stories passed down through generations, the ancient military reports written by officers who never fully recovered from what they witnessed, the silence that had defined this border for longer than most civilizations had even existed. She listened quietly, her expression growing more serious as I spoke, until I finally finished. "I did not realize it was still that heavy for everyone else," she said finally. "I suppose that makes sense. In a way, history does not always move at the same pace for everyone living through its consequences." She paused, then added something I have carried with me ever since. "For what it is worth, historian, I hope you tell them the truth when you go back. Not the frightening version, the real one. We are not hiding behind that border because we are dangerous. We are living behind it because, a very long time ago, we asked to be left alone, and we have simply been enjoying that peace ever since. If anyone out there is finally ready to stop being afraid, we would be glad to actually meet them properly." As my ship pulled away from the station and began its long journey back toward Galactic space, I found myself staring out at the same dark stretch of border I had once crossed, with trembling hands and a ship full of warning alarms. It looked different to me now, not because the space itself had changed, but because I understood, finally, what that silence had actually meant all along. 50,000 years of fear had not been maintained by the humans at all. It had been maintained by everyone else, passed down through generations who never bothered to ask whether the story they were repeating still matched the truth on the other side of that line. When I finally submitted my report to the Galactic Council, I did not soften the history. I included every detail I had uncovered, from the earliest confident reports of an empire expecting an easy conquest, to the uneasy, growing respect found in a dying officer's final entries, to the calm, restrained voice that had once let an entire defeated fleet walk away rather than destroy it completely. I owed the truth that much, even the difficult parts of it. But I ended my report with something the historical archives had never quite captured before, something I felt the Council needed to hear as clearly as any of the rest. "The border still exists," I wrote. "The beacons still broadcast their warning, exactly as they have for 50,000 years. But what waits on the other side of that line is no longer the same story that built this fear in the first place. It is simply a civilization, living quietly, waiting patiently, wondering, much like the rest of us, whether the galaxy will ever be ready to finally stop being afraid." I do not know if my report will change anything. Old fears rarely fade quickly, and 50,000 years is a difficult habit to break. But I know, standing at the edge of that border one final time before returning home, that I no longer felt the same fear I had carried with me on my very first approach. I felt, instead, something closer to hope. Quiet, uncertain, but real. And for the first time since beginning this journey, I found myself wondering not what might be waiting behind that line, but how long it might take before someone else finally worked up the courage to go and find out for themselves.